After the December 7, 1941 Japanese attack on the United States Naval Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, America found itself thrust into World War II. That event left people wondering, what if there was an attack on the American mainland, particularly on the United States Pacific coast? In 1942, that premise was put to the test in a most unusual way. This is extremely strange. The unforeseen attack on American forces at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, that resulted in the deaths of 2,403 Americans, prompted President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to formally request Congress to declare war and join Allied powers England, France, China, and the Soviet Union in forming a coalition to battle the major Axis powers of Germany, Japan, and Italy. At this time, the city of Los Angeles on the Pacific coast was the nation's leader in the manufacture of aircraft, with nearby San Pedro housing a significant number of naval vessels. In light of all this, there was a growing concern that California may become a prime target for a potential Japanese attack. Those concerns were justifiable. While Japan had concluded that an air attack mirroring that of the one on Pearl Harbor would likely fail because aircraft carriers would be at the mercy of American forces, submarines would be a more effective and surreptitious means of aggression. In fact, 2 strikes were launched against American vessels within 16 days of Pearl Harbor, with one resulting in the sinking of the oil tanker Montebello, and the other inflicting damage on the SS Absaroka, a lumber ship, killing 1 crew member. That particular attack took place on Christmas Eve. By February 19th, growing paranoia had reached its apex, and President Roosevelt signed an executive order allowing for the arrest and internment of Japanese Americans. On February 23rd, Japan's boldness reached another level when Japanese cruiser submarine I-17 entered the Santa Barbara Channel and opened fire on the Elwood oil field. Between 16 and 24 shells were fired, and only because of inaccuracy was a very large petrol container missed that would have caused massive damage. Despite that, the message was sent that we could be attacked on our own shores and with impunity. Fear and panic grew even higher, just as the Japanese hoped it would, as the West Coast began to feel even more vulnerable. By February 25th, radar had been installed along the coastline, and operators were becoming more proficient with it. So it was at 1:44 a.m. that morning that a military crew, manning the equipment in a secret location in the hills overlooking an isolated section of the California coast, picked up an unidentified aircraft moving at a high rate of speed, heading south to east over the Pacific Ocean. At 2 a.m., 2 other radar sites pinpointed its location at 120 miles due west of Los Angeles. At 2:15 a.m., anti-aircraft batteries in Los Angeles were placed on green alert, and by 2:21 a.m., a blackout for the city was ordered to conceal potential targets. Just as the object was about to enter the airspace of Santa Monica, and with guns poised to intercept its flight, it suddenly vanished. It was now 2:40 a.m., and residents of the Pacific Palisades observed a large flying object appear over the Santa Monica Mountains due east of their position. At 2:45, a sailor named Bill Stout had just finished fixing a flat tire on his car and was having a cigarette east of the Santa Monica Mountains. He claims he witnessed a huge, soundless aircraft just over the tops of the trees that he described as an upside-down life raft that blocked out most of the night sky. At that same time, another witness, C. Scott Littleton, watched as the object passed by his house in Hermosa Beach as it moved toward Baldwin Hills. It was described by one witness as a huge elliptical craft emanating an orange glow. At 3:06 a.m., at least 4 Santa Monica area anti-aircraft batteries turned their guns inland toward the object and opened fire out over the city toward Baldwin Hills, where it was said the air over Los Angeles erupted like a volcano. Anti-aircraft gunners fired approximately 1,400 rounds of artillery into the sky, as somewhere near 12,000 volunteer air raid wardens assumed their predetermined positions and duties, patrolling the streets to make sure all lights were extinguished and everyone was safely inside, while artillery shells fell from the sky, raining down on LA. With explosions taking place all around them, some residents peeked out of their windows to try and catch a glimpse of what was being fired upon. Their observations ranged from a blimp to dozens of planes. The greatest imminent danger remained the debris falling to the ground. People who did venture out, including the wardens, ducked for cover, with some of the more intrepid citizens scooping up metal fragments to scrap, as, after all, these were tough times with the world at war. Pilots of the 4th Interceptor Command were alerted, but their aircraft remained grounded. The artillery fire continued sporadically until 4:14 a.m. The all-clear was eventually sounded and the blackout order was lifted at 7:21 a.m. By the following morning, the LA Times had published their account of the event, which included a now famous but heavily doctored photo of searchlights honing in on what appears to be an aerial object being fired upon. In the aftermath, one retired police officer told a reporter, "We all got out and watched it. We saw something, but it was nothing definite. Seemed to be something circling slowly around. I was standing next to my commanding officer and he said, 'It looks like an airplane to me.'" As questions mounted as to the nature of what was fired at and the absence of trace evidence from any crashed aircraft to point to, the Army and Navy were squarely at odds with each other over whether these were actually enemy planes, unidentified planes, or any planes at all. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson and Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall initially said there were as many as 15 enemy aircraft likely sent on a reconnaissance mission. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox claimed that it was all a false alarm caused by jittery gunners, and it was the Army that bore responsibility for it. One anonymous soldier who claimed the object being fired upon was in reality an air balloon was summoned by his superiors and told that he would be court-martialed if he repeated that to anyone, and he was not to stray from the story that there were 7 Japanese planes being fired upon. California State Representative Leland Ford demanded an investigation into the matter, saying, "None of the explanations so far offered removed the episode from the category of complete mystification. This was either a practice raid, or a raid to throw a scare into 2 million people, or a mistaken identity raid, or a raid to lay a political foundation to take away Southern California's war industries." As a result of the incident, up to 5 people died that morning, ranging from automobile accidents to stress-induced heart attacks. Homes were damaged, with many of the volunteer wardens injured by falling shells, and a number of Japanese Americans were arrested by Los Angeles police on suspicion of somehow signaling to the intruders. In 1975, aviation expert and one-time LA Times aerospace editor Marvin Miles wrote a memo explaining what he believed occurred that was published in the Times. One point he put forth is that upon Japan's eventual surrender after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they insisted that no mission was flown over Los Angeles that night. Their culpability couldn't get any worse than after Pearl Harbor, so why would they deny this? Another possibility was that, in essence, gunners were shooting at each other's shells as they were illuminated by searchlights. Lastly, Miles proposed that a careful study of the evidence suggests that meteorological balloons, known to have been released over Los Angeles, may well have caused the initial alarm, a theory supported by the fact that anti-aircraft artillery units were officially criticized for having wasted ammunition on targets which moved too slowly to be airplanes. But rational explanations didn't deter some people in putting forth theories of an otherworldly nature. By the 1970s, the idea that an extraterrestrial invasion was responsible for igniting what would be referred to as the Battle of Los Angeles gained steam in the UFO community. The doctored photo in the LA Times was usually offered up as proof, as was the notion that whatever the object was, it was impervious to artillery fire, which would conveniently explain why no physical residue of it was ever found. Adding even more fuel to this fire were the release of what came to be known as the Majestic or MJ-12 documents in 1987. Contained within them was one particular item labeled the Marshall Roosevelt Memo, dated March 5, 1942, that claimed 2 alien craft were recovered after the battle and that it had been determined they were of interplanetary origin. For a myriad of reasons, this particular document has been debunked as a hoax, with various headings, contributors, and designations not falling in line with known facts at that time. It would be 5 years before amateur pilot Kenneth Arnold's sighting of saucer-like objects over Mount Rainier, Washington in 1947 caused a nationwide stir that jump-started the modern-day UFO awareness. At the actual time of the LA incident, no one was offering any type of extraterrestrial explanation for the event. That would all come decades later. Now, there is little doubt that people did see unidentified objects that night. Perhaps the Japanese did release a seaplane from a submerged submarine that night, because they certainly had the capability to do so. The most likely explanation for the events that led up to the Battle of Los Angeles probably lie with faulty intelligence, an errant balloon, or perhaps just bad training methods. The incident could also be an example of post-event retro thinking, which is basically assigning an extreme explanation to something that probably has a more mundane one. But we have to look at the one piece of evidence that has enthralled ufologists and conspiracy theorists for decades, and that is the photo. It's most often said it clearly shows searchlights being focused on some sort of craft, but as mentioned earlier, the photo was retouched before publication, which was a routine practice at the time to enhance black and white photos. For one, the searchlight beams seemed to focus and terminate on an actual object, rather than continue through and dissipate as they typically would if there was no actual physical object in the air. One should bear in mind, though, that a searchlight beam hitting a cloud often may in fact not pierce that cloud. It therefore is possible that the smoke generated by 1,400 rounds of ammunition trained on a specific area might form an artificial cloud that negates transparency. But given all this information, ultimately we have to make our own decisions. Certainly we're not going to get anything from the military except for the most basic explanations. And even the absence of any physical trace evidence of a plane, a balloon, or an extraterrestrial craft won't quash the opinions of many who insist something quite unusual happened in Los Angeles that night. Whatever did happen, it shed a stark light on the vulnerability that all Americans felt at the beginning of World War II, and how quickly that type of vulnerability can transform itself into chaos and mistrust.